It's always nice when I get to connect with somebody I already know to do this podcast, and today is no exception. I am chatting with Traci DeForge. She is the founder of Produce Your Podcast with a ton of experience in broadcast and executive management and more. We will have a lovely discussion about where the space of podcasting is and some thoughts on monetization. And Traci, thank you for joining me today.
I am so happy to be here, Matthew. We were just talking off mic about how it's so fun that we're connected in so many other ways, but getting together on the podcast is sort of the natural thing, but neither one of us ever thought about doing it until now. So it's great.
I know, right? It's the obvious thing to do. How do we overlook it?
Exactly.
Which is funny. It's funny you say that. When I was giving podcasting advice and I was doing audits, it always felt like one of the big things that I was doing was telling people something that they already knew. And they would just be like, oh, duh, of course. Why didn't I see that? Right. It's like right in front of my face, but right. It takes somebody else to kind of point it out to you. So I'm glad your team pointed this out to us and we are getting together. So, but before we jump into what Produce Your Podcast is and some of these other strategies, tell me, how did you find your way into the world of podcasting to begin with?
Well, I fell in love with the platform of audio just actually really, really young. I loved radio. I've shared this before, but I literally used to sleep with the radio underneath my pillow, listening to AM transmitter, ghost stories. And when my friends would come over, I would have them make radio shows. And my dad was the president of the March of Dimes when I was growing up, and the walkathons had live radio remotes. And so for me, it just was like a first love, first sight scenario for me. And then I had the most amazing opportunity to work for over 2 decades in broadcast radio professionally. But it wasn't until I was my own business owner and working and doing business development strategy for Fortune 500s. There's a specific project I was working on with Weight Watchers International that was it was a catalyst for me to want to start my own podcast. And at that point in time, I looked around and there weren't really, this again was 2015, there weren't a lot of full service production and marketing agencies at that time, if any, really, that was totally done for you. And I think because I worked in radio for so long, A, I was spoiled and I wanted a broadcast quality show. And B, I knew exactly what kind of work that was going to take. So I pulled a team together of people that I had worked with in the industry, and we launched my first podcast in March of 2016. And swiftly after that, I just really realized how many business owners could really benefit from a full service podcast production support, because I knew it was going to be just like social media and websites. And ultimately people were going to have a podcast for their business, just like they had those other marketing vehicles. And I just wanted to be there to help be a catalyst for their podcasts.
So with so much love for radio, experience in the broadcasting world, you make this transition over to podcasting. You bring management expertise, all these different things. One of the things that people love about podcasting is it's different from radio.
Yes,
but there's a lot we can learn from the broadcasting and the radio world. What are some of the key things that you brought from your expertise to podcasting that still apply today?
I think for me, because the majority of my broadcast radio experience was on the sales and management side. So that involved a lot of working with strategic partnerships and bigger brands and local businesses, and really helping them build an audio brand for themselves and really leverage radio in a way that was a business development tool. And so I think for me, having that level of expertise in how to work with the radio stations and the brands and the radio stations and the businesses was just such a natural transition for me on the audience growth and monetization side of podcasting, because a lot of the same formulas apply, a lot of the same strategies apply. But I also think what's so great is that, like, for me growing up, I mentioned how much I loved radio. And I mean, I was that girl who would call into the radio station and request like 2 out of 3 Ain't Bad from Meatloaf. And like, I would listen for when they would play my song. Radio was such as an aspirational place for me all through my youth, high school, college. And so when I actually had the opportunity to go work for radio, it was a big deal for me because it was so unattainable. And what I love about podcasting is that it's really made the platform of getting your voice out, it's made it so possible. And it's made the technology now over the last 10 years has evolved so much that it's made it easier and more simple to get your voice out. So I think from a strategy and execution standpoint, my expertise really helped with businesses to help grow their businesses through podcasting. But I also just think in general, podcasting has given accessibility to a platform that was so unattainable in the past. So many more people can have their voices heard and change conversations about things in their industry or things in their life. So that's what I truly love how the two have merged.
When you are working with businesses and they're developing a podcast, what do you find are the strategies that help them reach more listeners with their podcast? And then from there, turn that into useful conversions for their business?
Yeah, so there's kind of for me, there's a two-pronged answer for that, and it's a carryover from your first question. So when we build shows for clients, I fall back to the original radio clock, if you will. So we literally will and I use the language, the structured, unstructured podcast. And what we mean by that at Produce Your Podcast is that we will align a format for the host, that how they're going to open the show, how maybe they're going to highlight industry insights, if they're going to do Q&A interviews, integrating a special segment that has an opportunity for sponsorship and really showcase their expertise, how they utilize a music bed, professional open and close. So just that piece alone has been a really nice transitional piece of education and motivation for us to build shows that sound and feel and the listeners enjoy, because it's edutainment. It's not an infomercial. And I think that's just really important to start with a quality product, especially if you're a business owner. You need your podcast to be as professional as your website, as your social media. It needs to be an audio brand extension of who you are in your own voice. And then the audience growth piece becomes a little more simple, not too much more, but a little bit more simple, because everything has that continuity. When people experience your brand on the different platforms, they listen to your podcast, they watch it on YouTube, they go to your website, everything has a nice continuous flow. So that builds the trustworthiness and the credibility factor. And then when you get into really specific growth tactics, I mean, we could talk all day about that, but there's, consistency compounds over time. You've got to commit to a schedule that is going to be attainable for you, that you can not only just survive to maintain, but also thrive in. And because that consistency is so incredibly important for audience growth. And then looking at your marketing strategy and what are you doing organically? What are you doing to integrate your podcast in all the other areas that you're marketing? And then are you setting aside a specific budget to market your podcast maybe inside other podcasts that have similar audiences? So it's not a simple one size fits all, but there's certain pillars of this strategy that I just outlined that if all of those come together, then you're going to have organic and accelerated growth.
Do you find that there are particular platforms, and I know this is going to change from business to business depending on what they rely on and what they use and where they target stuff, but just in general, is there a platform that you think drives more direct listeners or subscribers to a podcast? Because we put out a ton of stuff on social media, we do email newsletters, we do podcasts, right? Like there's lots of these growth hacks that are out there. Some of them have a lot of merit, some of them work brilliantly, some of them people try and they don't work all that well, maybe it's for lots of different reasons. But like it's I find it's hard to go from brand recognition of a podcast to actual conversion of listening. And have you seen or found any trends that really show a better direct relationship with that, with where you're putting the message versus where they're coming in and becoming new subscribers?
Yeah, so the first answer to that, I'm going to just pinpoint how you started out, that it may be different for everyone. So at Produce Your Podcast, we work primarily with business owners. So we are working with the brands and the businesses who want to leverage their podcasts to basically increase their bottom line for visibility, for leads, and for sales. So the why for that and the end game for that is going to have a different strategy than someone who is maybe doing a true crime or an entertainment focus or a narrative storytelling focused podcast. Those are definitely two different types of growth strategies. So we're going to be focusing on the one that's going to be really optimized for the businesses who want to grow their business through their podcast. And in doing that, there's two schools of thoughts. And one is make sure those foundational pieces, like you said, are all buttoned up and have the podcast integrated into them. So that's the newsletter, that's your social media, that's how you have it presented on your website, that's your call to action in the show itself. That's a huge thing that a lot of times people they overlook the call to action. I literally just did a podcast audit yesterday for a business owner who is very successful and has a very successful show. But the way they ended their show was, okay, thanks, bye. And then and one of their biggest objectives for doing the podcast audit was because they said that they weren't getting enough conversions from the podcast to their newsletter or from the podcast to their website. And that was just such a simple, okay, but because you're not asking people to continue the conversation with you after the show, like highly engaged host, super powerful guests, really great show, but zero call to action at the end. So you've got to go through almost like a checklist of these foundational pieces first. And then you also have to have your mindset around your metrics to be appropriate, because I think that what is going to be successful for a niche podcast or business focused podcast, those metrics are going to be different than what you're expecting to hear out of a celebrity podcast or a Joe Rogan podcast, or again, the true crime podcast. Those have a wider audience and achieve wider results, lots more downloads. But in business focused podcasts, you don't need thousands and hundreds of thousands of downloads. If you are using the right call to action and the right strategy, you can convert quality over quantity. So that mindset around your metrics is really important. And then let's look at the platforms like you were asking. I personally am a huge advocate for leveraging other podcasts to promote your podcast, because you are already reaching people who are consuming content that they like on podcasts. Easy peasy. And then two, they're already consuming content that's similar to the content that you're putting out. So it is the perfect place to introduce your podcast to this audience who's already listening to podcasts and listening to podcast content similar to yours. So it's a natural conversion to be like, oh, well, I'll definitely check out this show because I'm already meeting box 1, box 2, and now box 3.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more that one of the best ways to promote your show is to have it on other podcasts, because at least you know there the target audience knows how to listen to a podcast, if nothing else, right? You put it a Facebook ad, you put it a Google ad, you put it anywhere else, it's like, I hope they know how to consume podcasts, or I hope they do consume podcasts. In a podcast ad, we know they're listening to podcasts. That's how they're getting this information. So
And
it's
if
very
you
wise.
are using those other platforms, I run across this a lot too. It's like Instagram might be your marketing platform of choice for your business. Let's say you're an interior design business, for example. Podcasting can work really well for interior design businesses. We've been producing multiple different interior design firms for years. But Instagram doesn't necessarily grow your podcast audience because you can't link directly to the episode from the stories, from the reels, from the posts. So you also want to be mindful of being on a platform where your audience is engaging, yes, but also being and marketing your podcast on a program or a platform where they can link to the episode, because we want everything so easy right now, right? Like we don't want to have to go hunt for anything or search for anything. Even if we know how to listen to podcasts, if you don't make it super simple, easy, then you're going to lose the opportunity for somebody to find your show.
I couldn't agree with that more. Shifting just a little bit, because I want to make sure we get on this topic of monetization. And, you know, for businesses, obviously, the big part of monetization isn't so much we're going to directly build an audience and sell ads and make money that way, right? It's usually we have this podcast so that we can make money over here where we tend to make more money, or, we've been working on this for a long, long time, right? Things are good. But you have an interesting series on other ways basically to monetize a podcast. And I'm curious what you think the future of that looks like for podcasters today who, they're reading the headlines, they're reading people saying podcasts is, it's the bubble has burst, it's not as good as it should, blah, blah, blah. Like all the doomsayers are out there. I don't believe that. And I sense you don't believe that, and that the future is pretty bright for podcasters who are taking this seriously.
100%. And so monetization, again, it's not a cookie cutter, one size fits all. And I think what you're speaking to is we do a lot of coaching for podcasters in how to monetize their show. And we focus on a couple of things. First of all, the cost per thousand model, it does work if you are in those higher tiers of listenership, 10,000 downloads of your podcast episode or more, then you're naturally going to be able to make more money off of the cost per thousand model. But most podcasters fall into the 9,999 or less, or significantly less category. But that does not mean that they cannot monetize their podcast. You can start monetizing your podcast even in a pre-launch stage based on the network that you bring to your business, to your audience. And what I mean by that is very similar to how we started out this podcast, when we were thinking, hey, we've known each other for years, but it never crossed our mind that we should actually, get together on a podcast interview. I encourage people to think about their immediate network the same way when it comes to monetization. Most likely, again, as a business owner who's using their podcast to grow their business, you will have vendor relationships that you've built over time, that you've purchased from for years. You have clients that own their own businesses that know you, like you, trust you, know the kind of work that you do. So they're going to believe that your product of the podcast that you put out is going to be similar to the quality of the work that you do in other areas. So you can start having conversations with people that that, and there's a phrase that I use quite frequently, and it's that most people underestimate the number of people they know. They underestimate the number of people they know, and they overestimate the number of people that know what they do. So if you really think about that, you underestimate the number of people you know. So if you really just sit down and think about, okay, who do I know that might be interested in being aligned with my podcast or my podcast content, or who could benefit from being in front of my audience, mighty quality over quantity audience. And then don't overestimate that people know what it is that you're doing, or know what it is, or know that you even have a podcast. So many people just assume that everyone knows what they're doing and that they have a podcast, and then they end up on the ball field or church or somewhere else, and they find out that, oh, I just launched a podcast last week. And I'm like, really? Did you know that I do that for a living? Like, it can happen to anybody. So you have to be very mindful of just really being able to acknowledge and put out to people what it is that you do, so that they think of you either when they're ready to use a product or service similar to yours, or they know somebody that they can refer you to. So that immediate warm network is incredibly important as you start the process of sponsorship and monetization. And then, to your point, you're marketing your own products and services in your own show is often sort of a like, duh moment, because that's your oceanfront real estate. Your podcast is your oceanfront real estate. No one is going to explain your products and services better than you're going to. You can bring in your own clients. You can bring in people that have worked with you, share their stories. You can share success stories through podcast interviews like we're doing right now. And your own products and services, you can get conversions that way. That is a monetization strategy. And then the third piece is, I'm going to, again, circle back to what we were talking about. A lot of times people don't think about marketing their podcast on other podcasts, but the piece that they really don't think about, which is where we're finding a lot of success with our clients right now, is invest in the ad strategy to grow your show and have it underwritten by your sponsors. So very specifically how this works is that if you sell a sponsor into your show, they can access your audience vertically and the audience that you're already currently reaching. But if you supplement that with an audio ad spend strategy that you're getting in front of mirrored audiences that are consuming similar content, then they are likely going to want to do business with the sponsor that's interested in your audience. So include that sponsor in that ad strategy. So then you go to your brand, and this can work for local businesses up to, household name brands. You're saying you're going to reach my highly engaged audience vertically, and then we're going to get this many impressions and this many plays of my podcast in a widespread mirrored audience that is listening to similar content. So you're going to get a wide horizontal reach and a vertical reach. And once you can have those types of conversations, it's almost a no-brainer, because they get impressions, they get the whole language around cost per thousand. They get the whole, that's where you can compete with digital marketing in a big way, because you can bring the same language to them in those conversations. So we're getting a little bit in the weeds about it, but I really like talking about it because it's something that people aren't really necessarily connecting the dots on quite yet. And I feel like it's something that could really explode for people with smaller audiences to really be able to achieve bigger results.
Well, so that was actually going to be my next question, which is, what we're talking about, easier said than done when you're getting 5, 10, 50,000 downloads on an episode. What if you're a smaller show, very tight niche audience? You're very specialized, your audience is engaged, but often we say podcast ads, and company first question is how many downloads do you get, and you're going to be like, not enough. But how do you turn that around? How do you make a smaller show work for you?
Yes, so I think that's an excellent question. And so much of that, again, has to do with your mindset around your metrics, because how you feel about them is going to translate in the energy of which you bring in the conversation. So if you are, and this is 100% the types of audiences that we're working with, we're seeing sponsorship work successfully in, for example, a divorce attorney who's licensed to Minnesota and Wisconsin. They're geographically restricted. They are a divorce podcast. So they're already a niche audience of either you're going through one, somebody who's going through one, or you're thinking about going through one. And so that strategy, her downloads are 300 maybe or less on average. But the conversation that she has with the brands that have sponsored her show it is a smaller audience, but the quality of the audience that I'm reaching is exactly who you need to be talking to. So you're not just doing a ricochet, sporadic approach to your marketing. You're getting, every single episode, you're getting in front of people who need your services, and that can be anything from travel to weight loss to recovery programs. Like, you have to think about what are the services that your audience needs when they're going through a divorce, and how can those businesses support them. The same with a podcast that we produce called Berry Nation, which is very specific to people who are having gastric bypass surgery, or they are considering having gastric bypass surgery. They're very specific nutrition drinks, protein bars, how they travel changes, their wardrobe changes, even psychology, the mindset around food changes. And so that's a very niche audience, but they're able to connect with brands who want to reach that very specific audience. And then they also have a community, so they can convert people from their podcast into their community and monetize it that way. So I'm one of those people that's like, yeah, don't talk to me about small audiences that don't work. Talk to me about how small audiences can work. And yes, it's a more difficult conversation to a cold outreach. And this is why we encourage you to start having these conversations with brands that you already know and already know of you. And then, hit that bullseye target in the center with your warm network, and then go out from there. But it's 100% possible and probable to get sponsors for 1,500 downloads or less. Literally, we specialize in it, and we've seen it happen successfully over and over. But you gotta really be comfortable having the conversation. And that can be done through, you can gather your own social proof. How are people acting on your podcast? Do you do podcast surveys? Are you getting comments on your social media that you can screenshot? What are your reviews like on your show? Like, there are ways that you can show transformation of your audience from your podcast, even starting by marketing your own products and services, and track your own data that way. And then have that as a case study story as you're talking to other advertisers.
This is all, as we are starting the new year here, this is some great advice to think about how to approach your show, how to, really hit your revenue milestones in 2025, is to think about your show differently, put more credence to all the specific things that you're doing, put more into, all the extra places that your podcast touches people, not just right directly in the earbuds, coming through Apple Podcasts or Spotify or something like that. So love these thoughts and hope more people get a chance to act on them. As a reminder, we're chatting with Traci DeForge. She's the founder of Produce Your Podcast. She's a consultant. She does a ton of other stuff. She hosts Growth Accelerator podcast, Journey There, and Ask Brian radio show. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a live radio show that's based out of Los Angeles. It's repurposed as a podcast. It's probably, I'm a little bit of a shoemaker with no shoes when it comes to my own podcast sometimes. Even that's one of the things I started Produce Your Podcast so that I wouldn't put my own shows. But what I didn't, because I'm so focused on our clients, right? And I was doing business development strategy at that time. And I was like, okay, I need a team, because if left to my own devices, I know I'm going to put my clients first. And so I need a team to hold me accountable. And then I started a podcast production company, and all my clients have podcasts. So I have challenges, people. I'm not going to lie, but a live radio show keeps you accountable because you have to show up every week for that show. And we repurpose that as a podcast. But so thank you for that. But yes, produceyourpodcast.com is by far the best way. You can check out all of those and some of the examples of some of the sponsorship integrations that we're talking about today. That's one of the things I love about our portfolio page. You can go hit some of these shows and you can hear how the sponsors are integrated into them. We have some great blogs on sponsorship and monetization that dig a little deeper into what I was talking about today. But I just encourage people to start where they are with it, because I come from a background of broadcast radio sales. It sounds really easy for me to sit here and say, oh, all you need to do is this. All you need to do is that. I get it that if you're a financial advisor or you're an interior designer or you're a coach or you're a consultant, this doesn't come naturally to you. But talking to people that you already know, that you're already doing business with, does come naturally for you. So all you have to do is just pivot that conversation around, hey, have you ever considered wanting to be involved with my podcast? And just start the conversation from there and build on that, because that really truly is the easiest way. And think about all of the other touch points you can give your audience through your to your sponsor, to your audience. So like you said, newsletter, social media, blog post, website, show notes, like you can feature them in all of these other areas. So all of a sudden that conversation isn't just about how many downloads you have. It's, I have this engaged audience plus all these other touch points you'll be included in. And then they're like, hey, sign me up.
Right. That's all they want, is access to people. So if you can just provide them as much access to people as you can, then you're doing your job. Well, as a reminder, we'll have all those links here in the show notes, but produceyourpodcast.com is the best place to, find Traci and all the great things that she is working on. Before we let you go, a couple of questions we like to ask everybody who appears on the show. First one is there a place in podcasting where you would like to see improvement, whether it's from content creation, distribution, consumption? Is there just something that's annoying at you about podcasting that you'd like to see fixed?
I don't know if this is something that's fixable, but what I would love to see is people not diminish their perception around the power of audio podcasts. Yes, there's a place for video. Yes, there's a place for audio. Audio is very strong. Theater of the mind is amazing. The ability to connect with people in a portable medium, to get around screen fatigue, to all of the things, like the 2024 was the year of conversation around video, and then it became video podcast, and then it became, oh, you have an audio podcast. So, I've often thrown a temper tantrum saying I did not launch and grow Produce Your Video podcast, I built Produce Your Podcast. And the power of audio from early radio days preceded television. Audio podcasts preceded the term video podcast. Like, audio podcasts are still incredibly powerful. So I just don't want that perception to be shifted, changed, or diminished just because YouTube plays strongly in the video space now.
Yeah, I mean, I think listen, I agree. Video is obviously an important. Video is very popular. It's popular on all the platforms, right? We prioritize video in our lives. We see it everywhere we go. If you can do video, if you can put out video, it can only help you, right? Reach more people, find more people. But I'm not convinced that just because more people are consuming podcasts on YouTube, that more people are actually watching podcasts, right? The joy of podcasting is it's one of the mediums that you can really absorb, be entertained, laugh, right? Like, you can feel all those things while still doing something else. And with video, that becomes a lot harder. So I agree with you. Produce video, use it to your advantage, but don't don't forget the audio audience. Don't forget the people who listen while they're driving, while they're working out, doing dishes, running, walking, whatever. Like, don't lose that focus. Audio conversations have been around thousands of years and will be around thousands of years in the future, even when the RSS feed and YouTube go away.
Yeah, and a piggyback to that, because you were asking like what would be one thing you would change. So this you can change right now if you're a podcaster. If you were recording a podcast, if you're creating content for audio and for video, please do not forget that your audio audience cannot see what it is that you're talking about. So be very mindful. I use this very specific example. We're recording right now in video. You can see the back of my wall. The back of my wall, for those of you listening, are multiple different examples of cover arts of podcasters that we produce, shows that we produce.
Awesome, by the way. It's a great wall.
Oh, thank you so much. But if you had just said, "Hey, Traci, that's a great wall," and I said, "Thanks, Matthew, I appreciate it," then the person listening would not be able to feel included or part of our conversation. So we're automatically dismissing and alienating them. Where if you said, "Hey, Traci, tell me about that wall. It's pretty cool," and then I said, "Thanks, Matthew. It's a wall full of shows that we've produced over the years," then the person listening can visualize that in their own mind, and they don't feel like they just got kicked out of a conversation. And I think if you're a podcaster, if you don't take anything else away from this conversation today, be mindful of your listening audience when you're recording video.
And I would also stress, there are lots of shows that, they talk about something they saw on social media or things like that. And you can't really embed images into your podcast post, but you can embed links. So go ahead and say, "Oh, I saw that post on Instagram. There's a link to it in our show notes," so that somebody listening can go quickly click it, see it, and then be a better part of the conversation. So love that advice. And yes, I would encourage people who are listening, go look for a clip of Traci. I'm sure we're going to post plenty of them, and check out her wall behind her. It's very cool, especially if you're a production company or clients or lots of podcasts. It's a great way to design your office. Is there any tech on your wish list, like hardware, software, something either that's out there that you just haven't quite, pulled the trigger on, or something that's yet to be invented that would make your life better or easier or more enjoyable?
Oh, wow. God, that's a question that stumps me a little bit, because I love to adopt new technology. Like I like to experiment with the new stuff. But I think where I am as a business owner right now, I feel like we have really good podcasting tech and engineering tech in our business. So my focus right now is, I'm just going to answer this of where I am. I'm really looking at support technology for lead generation, for business development, for we already have an amazing project management software that we use, and I feel really confident about our engineering technology. So what I'm exploring right now and really looking at are things that make lead generation, cold outreach, things that are good aggregators as business development tools for us to grow our own business. So I don't know that that's really necessarily a fair podcasting tech question. but I do really feel strongly that that's an important part of business, is to be able to establish your systems around lead generation and outreach and how you're growing your business outside of your podcast. So that's our 2025. That's what we're really focused on for next year.
Love it. All right. And last thing, is there a podcast or two that are your absolute favorites to listen to? The ones that, regardless of what else you're listening to, whatever you're doing, they drop a new episode, you're going to listen to it.
Okay, you're not going to expect this answer because no one will probably. But this is such also a good example of why you should never, if you can help it, not pod fade. And if you do, just acknowledge it and come back. So one of my all-time favorite podcasts for years has been Alanis Morissette's podcast. Now, I'm huge into music and I worked in, as we know, in the industry for years, but her podcast is actually not about her music. It's about her personal growth journey, her journey as a workaholic, her issues around her, really getting a lot. She interviews a lot of really great people around the personal growth side of things. But she hadn't released an episode in, I want to say, like 4 years. And it was about 6 months ago, it popped up in my feed that she had a new episode. So that's what triggered the memory when you said, like, what's the podcast? When it pops up in your feed, you're like, stop everything and listen. I literally was like, what am I doing right now? Alanis Morissette has a new episode out. And I posted about it because she had been gone so long without releasing one. And then she released one. And I was like a kid in a candy store. I could not wait to listen to it. And sadly, she only just released the one. And I thought she was going to be back in her groove. So my lesson and takeaway for this, of people listening, is like, your audience loves you and they love when they hear from you, and don't disappoint them. Like, figure out a way to have a sustainable release schedule and stick to it, even if it's once a month, once a quarter, preferably more frequently than that. But just really be mindful that you're building a relationship. And so if you ghost them with your podcast, you're going to be disappointing them. And then when you reach out and do the text and re-engage with them like you would if you had ghosted somebody and re-engage with them, then they're excited to hear from you. Don't do it again.
Well, even though it's technically a coincidence, I'm just going to say, isn't it ironic? We've been chatting with Traci DeForge, founder of Produce Your Podcast. Learn more at produceyourpodcast.com, and we'll have links to that and all the other things that she's working on in the show notes. Traci, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Matthew. It was so fun.